Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us virtually for Kenyon's annual Martin Luther King Jr. Day of Dialogue. Every January, we come together to celebrate Dr. King's legacy, a legacy that is just as relevant today as it was during the civil rights battles of the 1960s, and that becomes more vital to remember and honor with each passing year. This morning, I took part in Knox County's 19th annual Martin Luther King Jr. celebration breakfast alongside educational and civic leaders in our community. And now I'm very much looking forward to an engaging 90 minutes of discussion connecting Dr. King's work to current issues affecting our campus and the world. I'd like to thank everyone who helped to make both events possible, those here at Kenyon and our friends at nearby Mount Vernon Nazarene University. In a few moments, we'll hear from our keynote speaker, Dr. Gretchen Sorin. Around 4:45, Dr. Sorin will take part in a question and answer session with their friend and colleague, Peter Rutkoff, Professor Emeritus of American Studies. Viewers will be invited to ask questions through the Zoom chat function. We'll conclude today's event by opening two breakout rooms, one dedicated to national activism, moderated by Professors Ted Mason and Jonathan Taswell, and one dedicated to campus and local activism, moderated by Professor Peter Rutkoff. Viewers are welcome to enter either room, and Dr. Sorin will visit both. The past 2 years of pandemic disruption have forced us all to reevaluate the role of travel in our lives. I suspect we've all come to view journeys that were previously unremarkable through a different lens, coming to more fully appreciate both the opportunity for growth and fulfillment that the freedom of travel provides and the associated risks, uncertainties, and even dangers. In the United States, the expansion of the automobile and the highway system in the mid-20th century expanded the capacity for travel. For many white Americans, this increased capacity for travel went hand in hand with real and romanticized expansions of freedom. For Black Americans, increased capacity for travel both expanded freedom and laid bare the still significant barriers to that freedom. This is the topic of Gretchen Sorin's most recent book. In Driving While Black, African American Travel on the Road to Civil Rights, Dr. Sorin explores how car ownership provided a measure of safety and independence for Black Americans, and also played a vital role in the civil rights movement, in the words of a New Yorker magazine review of the book. While plenty has been written about how Americans fell in love with their cars as interstate highways, roadside motels, and fast food restaurants were established, this history usually focuses on white America. Dr. Sorin explains how things like segregated public transportation, a history of restricted freedom of movement, and resources like the Negro Motorists Green Book combine to create a unique cultural phenomenon for Black Americans. Driving While Black was named one of the best nonfiction books of 2020 by Bloomberg, and Dr. Sorin was a finalist for 2021 NAACP Image Award in the category of Outstanding Literary Work Nonfiction. She and filmmaker Ric Burns were also recognized with an American Bar Association Silver Gavel Award for a feature-length PBS documentary based on the book. Beyond her authorship of this and other books, Dr. Sorin has had a lifelong love of museums, leading to a distinguished career as a museum administrator, educator, and exhibition creator. She currently serves as director and distinguished professor at the Cooperstown Graduate Program in Museum Studies at SUNY Oneonta. She holds a master's degree from that program, as well as a bachelor's degree from Rutgers University and a doctorate from SUNY Albany. I'm delighted to have Gretchen Sorin here with us today. Please join me in welcoming her to Kenyon. Dr. Sorin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Decatur. I'm very excited to be here and finally to the invitation of my good friend, Peter Rutkoff. It's great to meet so many of the faculty, and I'm really excited about this opportunity. I'd like to begin this afternoon by reading a brief passage from the letter from a Birmingham jail, and then I will share some slides with you. The letter from Birmingham jail was written by Dr. Martin Luther King on April 16th, 1963, in response to a call for unity, which was a letter written by white clergy that urged people not to protest, but rather to use the courts if they felt their rights were violated, and most importantly, to stay away from outsiders. And of course, Dr. King would have been an outsider at that in that city. So here's the quote. When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you, when you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored, when your first name becomes nigger, your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John, and your wife and mother are never given the respected title of Mrs. When you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into an abyss of injustice where they experience the bleakness of corroding despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. I'd like to share my screen with you now. When we think about freedom in the United States, we often think about the freedom of religion and the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press, but we don't think much about mobility. And that's what I'm going to ask you to think about today, is the importance of your mobility, the ability to go where you want to go, when you want to go. This you may recognize as Times Square. It's the Times Square subway stop during the days of COVID. And I'm showing it to you because it almost never, it rarely ever looks like this, but it demonstrates the limitations on our mobility that we all have experienced during this pandemic. For African Americans, limited mobility began as soon as we stepped on the shores of the New World. Enslaved people had to carry passes with them in order to travel. This is a paper pass, and it is signed by Mrs. James Madison, the wife of the President of the United States. It's dated 1843. And these are metal tags that were used in Charleston to identify enslaved people and determine whether or not they had the right to travel, to be off of the property of their masters. Mobility was so important to enslaved people that they took their mobility by running away. But towns and communities, and very often the very first police departments established in the United States, were established as slave catchers. And here you can see the men of the town who have gathered on horseback to look for enslaved people who are out after dark, and they're checking their passes. This is a broadside from Boston, and you can see it tells enslaved people, tells Black people, colored people here on the broadside, to be wary of the police, because the police are often kidnappers and slave catchers. And the very earliest badges for sheriffs and slave catchers look very much like the ones that we use now. So this relationship of policemen, police officers, law enforcement officers, as those out to control slaves, control the mobility of people of color, begins very early in the history of our country. The Great Migration was a very important event in the history of African Americans. It's the largest movement of people in the history of the country. And here you can see an automobile with all of the worldly possessions of a family tied to their automobile. Now, people moved from the rural South to the urban North with automobiles. They moved with trains, they moved with buses. If you had a car, however, it was a lot easier because you could leave town in the middle of the night. Often bus stations and train stations were monitored because overseers in the South did not want to lose their labor forces. Whether people worked in factories or in fields, they were afraid that they would leave. And so it was much easier to sneak out of town if you had a relative in the North with an automobile that they could bring down to the South and help you get away. Travel by buses and trains was segregated, of course, as was mentioned. And not only was it segregated, but it was humiliating. The bus driver might toss epithets at the drivers, at the riders throughout the trip. People would make you stand. If white people would make you stand if they needed a seat. It was humiliating for African American adults, and they were terrified that their children would grow up with terrible complexes, inferiority complexes, because of the humiliation of travel in segregated conveyances. And you can see this is not only was the bus and the train segregated, but the waiting rooms were segregated. This is a train car, and you can see on the back of the seats, it says "for colored." The Negro car on the train was crowded, it was filthy, it was rarely cleaned. And as you can see here, it was incredibly crowded. And here, an example of a train car for white people. Very different. So African Americans loved their automobiles, and they preferred their automobiles. Large, even if you couldn't afford a house, or you couldn't purchase a house because you couldn't get a mortgage, you might be able to purchase an automobile. And African Americans bought automobiles in large numbers. If you weren't able to purchase a new car, you would buy a used car. If the automobile dealership wouldn't sell you a car, you might get a white friend or colleague to purchase a car for you. So African Americans bought as many automobiles as they could afford. And so by the 1950s, this is a photograph from the 1950s behind a Ford station wagon. By the 1950s, African Americans were consuming automobiles just as they were consuming percolators and refrigerators and all of the other consumer goods that were popular in the 1950s and for 1950s families. African Americans preferred particular types of cars. This is a Buick, and it's the Electra Limited. And the Electra Limited was a very plush car, and it was a very heavy car. And if you think about the reason that African Americans wanted large cars, if you had to carry your blankets and pillows, all of your food for perhaps a day or maybe 2 days or 3, if you had to carry extra water for the radiator, and you had to carry maybe even some gasoline because you didn't know if you could stop at a gas station, you needed a car that was comfortable so you could sleep in it, but also a trunk that was large enough to carry all of the gear that you might need. So your car really became a home away from home, like a rolling living room. This is an example just of a snapshot, a family snapshot of a family who is stopped by the side of the road with their trunk open so that they can consume their food, since they couldn't stop at a restaurant. This is the famous Chuck Berry, and he's leaning on his beautiful 1950s Cadillac. And this Cadillac, by the way, is now at the Smithsonian Institution. Chuck Berry, Mahalia Jackson, Sammy Davis Jr., a lot of entertainers purchased Cadillacs. They purchased them because they were luxurious and they were comfortable, and they often had to spend a lot of time in their cars, but they also purchased them because they had the money to purchase them. There are stereotypes about African Americans owning Cadillacs, not being able to, living in ghettos, living in poor housing, but not being able, but putting all their money into Cadillacs. Well, only about 3% of African Americans purchased Cadillacs, but often African Americans could afford a really luxurious car. If you went to a bank to try and get a mortgage for a house, you were often denied. Black neighborhoods were redlined, which prevented banks from offering mortgages for those properties. And so African Americans with disposable income, the growing Black middle class, had a lot of disposable income that they could put into their automobiles, and they did. And that's one of the reasons they were able to purchase high-end Buicks and Cadillacs and other cars. But there were other reasons you might pick a particular brand of car. This is Medgar Evers, who was a field secretary for the NAACP. And his job was very dangerous. He had to go out to the sites of cross burnings and Black church burnings, the sites of lynchings. And the car that he chose to drive was a Rocket 88. Now, the Rocket 88 was a really fast car. It was also a wide car, and Medgar Evers was more than 6 feet tall. So he could stretch out on the seats of the car and he could sleep. But also the motor in the Rocket 88 would take off if you just hit the accelerator. And that enabled him to outrun vehicles that might be chasing him. And of course, in 1963, Medgar Evers was shot beside his car in the driveway of his home. There was another reason for African Americans to buy cars like the one you're seeing. This is a Cadillac, a beautiful Cadillac, parked on a street in Harlem with the owners peeking out from inside the car. If you were a family who had moved to the North during the Great Migration, you probably, like my family, went back home to the South every summer to visit family. And a fine car was one way to show everyone in the neighborhood that you had made it, that you were successful, that you had a good job, and that you had a beautiful car. But I'd like you to think for a moment about the intersection between race and space. What would it have been like before the automobile? Before cars, people really stayed put. If you think about, I live in upstate New York, and there's a little town about every 7 to 10 miles in upstate New York. And every single little town has its own Presbyterian church and its own Episcopal church and its own Baptist church, its own little general store, its own post office. And that was because people didn't go from town to town. They generally stayed within a few miles, 5 miles or so from home. But the automobile changes that, and people are going out on the road and they are encountering other communities and other people that they're not familiar with. And there's a real landscape of segregation that African Americans are finding as they begin to travel across the country. And it's a very negative landscape. There are signs like this one for nigger chicken along the road. This is a chain, a nationally famous, it says, chain of restaurants that started in Salt Lake City, but continued all over California and up and down the western coast of the United States. This is a sign in Alabama. Welcome to Klan country. It must have been terribly frightening to encounter signs like this one. This is a handmade sign on a beach. And this is the banner across the street in Greenville, Texas. Greenville welcome, the blackest land, the whitest people. And so this landscape of segregation that African Americans encountered was terribly frightening. So although the automobile gave them some freedom, some measure of freedom to travel where they wanted, when they wanted, they had to be very careful because they didn't know where they would be welcome and where they would be met with hostility. There were hundreds and hundreds of sundown towns across the United States. many of them in the Midwest, but they were in every region of the country. And a sundown town was a place that African Americans could work during the day. They could work in service as maids, as gardeners, as chauffeurs, but they had to be out of town by 6 o'clock, by sundown. There were even a few towns that had sirens that notified African Americans that they needed to get out of town. And there were many, many sundown towns in Ohio. And this, thinking about, again, the landscape of segregation, this is a fair in Colorado. Can you imagine encountering this Ferris wheel at a county fair? And of course, not only was there intimidation, but there were real fears. And there were examples of people who encountered the Klan or a Klan rally and were lynched, or their cars were turned over, as you see here. One of the reasons for choosing a large and heavy car was a car that would be hard to turn over if you encountered an angry mob. So African Americans stuck to the highways as much as they could. Also a double-edged sword, because as the highways were built, they were often put through Black communities, destroying Black communities. They also destroyed immigrant communities. And so even though the highway was a positive thing for African American travelers, and they felt more protected by staying on the highways, it also destroyed Black communities. So in 1936, a publisher in Harlem, New York, named Victor Green, created a small guidebook called the Negro Motorists Green Book. He had had a bad experience of travel, and he wanted to make travel better for himself and for others. His goal with the Negro Motorists Green Book was to put himself out of business. He hoped that someday the Negro Motorists Green Book would not be needed. And this was just an alphabetical listing by state of hotels and motels, restaurants and roadhouses, service stations, but also beauty parlors, barbershops, drugstores, places where African Americans could feel comfortable and where they would be welcome. This is Victor and Alma Green. And I show you Alma because Victor Green dies in 1960. And when he does, Alma takes over. And she and 4 other women operate the Negro Motorists Green Book. And it becomes an early women-owned publishing company. The Negro Motorists Green Book was geared toward the Black middle class, as you can see from this image of the couple with the perfectly matched luggage, their tidy middle-class home in the background, and their automobile. Victor Green felt that if middle-class African Americans could go out on the road and meet white Americans, that white Americans would change their minds. It would convince them that African Americans were just like them. The language of the Negro Motorists Green Book was never inflammatory. It was always very middle class, very polite, and never really specifically dove into the language of segregation. It said things like, carry your green book with you, you may need it. And I think this was because Victor Green got a lot of support for the Green Book from the white community, from the liberal white community, and he didn't want to anger them. And so he kept the language of the Green Book very modest and very polite. But I'd like you to think for a moment about how important the automobile was to the civil rights movement. I would argue there could have been no civil rights movement at the time in the 1960s without the automobile. This is A.G. Gaston's motel in Birmingham, and it's showing you the motel when people have gathered in the street right after the motel has been bombed. When people went south to participate in the civil rights movement, they needed places to stay and they needed places to eat. And those people who owned motels and restaurants for travelers, at their peril, they opened these places to civil rights workers, which was very courageous, but it was also very dangerous. And these places were often bombed. This is the Jenkins Microbus, also an object now at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. And this bus was used to register voters. Now, if you were going out to do voter registration, you had to have a car. You couldn't get around an entire county or several counties without a car. Going door to door on foot just wouldn't work. So this car and many other cars like it were used by those folks that were going out and registering voters, going door to door to help people pass the poll tests. They were bringing health care, they were bringing vaccines, they were bringing books so that people could learn to read. It was the automobile that facilitated this kind of travel. But especially for boycotts, you needed an automobile. So this is Martin Luther King on the right, who is ushering these women into a car during the Montgomery Bus Boycott. The goal of the Montgomery Bus Boycott was to stop people from riding the buses until they were desegregated. In order for these women and all of the other riders to get to work, they needed transportation. And that transportation was provided by automobiles, private cars, colored taxis, and a fleet of automobiles that were purchased just to drive people to their jobs. Without these cars, people would not have been able to get to work and they would have lost their jobs. By purchasing this fleet of cars and driving people to work, they were able to cut the revenue for the bus companies by 69%. And this was done in Montgomery, but it was also used in Florida and in other southern states where there were boycotts. So the automobile became the tool that helped to facilitate the boycotts. So what happens? What happens to all of these African-American tourist homes and guest homes that are listed in the Green Book? What happens to African-American travel? Well, at the same time that the Green Book was being used by African-American travelers, the NAACP was suing Hilton Hotel and Howard Johnson's and other white hotels to open public accommodations to all people. And here you can see in Atlanta, a boycott. You see the Klan protecting the hotel from this African-American protester. The Civil Rights Act broke open Howard Johnson's, Hilton, and all public accommodations to everyone. The Negro Motorists Green Book goes out of business, as do all of the other travel books that were made for segregation. And all of these places are now open to African Americans. All of the Black hotels, Black tourist houses, Black-owned guest homes, most of them, almost all of them, go out of business. They don't go out of business because all African Americans stop using them, but they go out of business because enough people go to Howard Johnson's and go to Hilton because they can, right? Because they've worked so hard to break these places open. But enough of the tourist homes go out of business. So now we find that there are probably only about 5% of the listings in the Negro Motorist Green Book that are still extant. But where are we today? This you may recognize as Philando Castile, who was shot in his automobile by a police officer. I'm sure you're familiar with Ahmaud Rashad, who was shot because he was running in a neighborhood where he was not perceived to be supposed to be. He was not supposed to be, according to the white men that murdered him. And of course, George Floyd, who was murdered by a police officer, he was pulled from his van. So he too was in an automobile at the time, just before he was murdered by the police. In the United States, this is a chart that shows you police deaths. African Americans are disproportionately affected, clearly, by police shootings. This is deaths per million. You see for Blacks, 1,252 deaths, for Hispanics, 877, and for whites, deaths per million. You see, the total number is 2,385. Of course, African Americans are only 13% of the United States population. One of the things I think that's most surprising to people is that I tell them I have a son, and when he became old enough to get a driver's license, I had to talk with him about how he should behave. My husband and I talked to him about how he should behave when he's stopped by the police. And that seems to be the most surprising thing to white parents, that African-American parents have to have this talk with their Black sons. But this is the information that Kenya Young, who was executive producer of NPR's Morning Edition, when she had the talk with her sons, this is the information that she gave them. Don't wear your hood. Don't put your hand in your pocket. If you get stopped, don't run. Put your hands up. Don't make a lot of moves. And then tell them your mother works for NPR, which I thought was a really interesting thing for her to say. But handy hints, this is a cartoon that appeared in a Minneapolis newspaper for drivers stopped by police. Be courteous, obey all lawful orders, have license and registration ready, and oh, by the way, avoid being Black. This is a photograph that I think is very important, although it's very fuzzy. And what it's showing, on the right-hand side, you see a 90-year-old grandmother. And she stepped in front of these police officers. You see they have their guns drawn. She stepped in front of them to protect her grandson and to diffuse, to de-escalate the situation. Her grandson had been pulled out of his automobile. One of the things that we do not do in this country is teach police, we don't do enough of it, is teach police officers how to de-escalate tense situations. We spend a lot of time, and they spend a lot of time at the shooting range, learning to shoot, practicing their shooting, but very little time practicing how to de-escalate tense situations, difficult situations. And so those situations escalate to somebody being killed. Oop. Sorry, I wanted to end again with the letter from a Birmingham jail. And in the letter, near the end, Dr. King tells us, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities. And in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation. I think what's most prophetic about these words is that they could have been written this year, or they could have been written last year. And now I welcome your questions and your comments. No comments.
Great, and thank you, Professor Sorin. And I think we transition to Peter. Are you ready for a Q&A with Dr. Sorin?
Well, I will pass on any questions, but I think people should ask them directly, don't you?
Oh, I think if folks have questions, please put them into the chat. And if there are questions or things that you'd like to get started on the conversation, we can move forward.
I'll start with Gretchen. Can you hear me?
Sure.
I think one of the things that's interesting about the way in which race relations in the South worked before the 1960s were all of the informal rules that one knew or didn't know about what side of the street to walk on or where you could go in the swimming pool. And I had done a little reading once upon a time about the way in which African Americans were not supposed to pass white cars on the open highway. That was a sign of disrespect. And I don't know, wonder if you came across that. And that was a reason for needing a big Olds 88 so that you could outrun your pursuer.
You weren't supposed to pass the cars, and you were supposed to give white people the right of way if you came. So, if two people came to an intersection at the same time, a four-way intersection, you were supposed to give people the right of way. But one of the things that happened is that there were so many accidents as a result of those rules that even in the most egregious states, they decided that traffic safety was more important than Jim Crow. So they made it so you really didn't have to give away the right of way, because you couldn't always tell how could you tell if somebody was, you couldn't always tell who was black and who was white, first of all. And then if it was dark, you couldn't tell who was in the car. So safety first. In a wagon, it was easy to tell. If you were horses and wagons, it was very easy to tell because they're much slower. But with an automobile, it was decided that safety came first. But every single state had its own rules. So, and I think Pauli Murray wrote a book about all of the different rules of segregation, and some of them were just silly. I mean, black and white people couldn't play chess together. Black and white criminals couldn't be handcuffed together. But it depended on what state you were in, what the rules were, and you were just supposed to know what those rules were. That's what happens to Emmett Till, right? He doesn't know what the rules are, and he gets into trouble because he doesn't know the rules. But the rules change depending on what state you're in, even what county you were in.
So there's a question in the chat from Professor Wendy Singer. Can you talk a bit more about the word mobility? The way your work changes the relationship between movement and constraint, both in terms of physical space and economic space.
Oh, interesting. Well, I think when we were thinking about mobility in the film in particular, we were thinking about moving through physical space and how restricted that was for African Americans. Yeah, economic mobility is another issue, and certainly African Americans were restricted economically from moving up. I mean, you were restricted from buying a house, for example, is a perfect example of that. And it's not really the subject of my research, but it certainly ties in to the ownership of automobiles and why African Americans preferred to buy these large, fancy cars, which was a stereotype, right? The stereotype that Black people always buy Cadillacs or really fancy cars.
Yep, thanks. And there's also a question, Chris Fallman is asking, I wonder how the emphasis on car travel and time in cars may have translated into Black radio listening.
Oh, that's a great question. What's interesting is as you're traveling across the country, you're going to lose the radio stations. I did actually talk with a couple of Black radio stations, and there was no Sirius radio in the 60s. So you couldn't hold on to a radio station as you were traveling across the country. You had to find those radio stations that were local. And certainly they were easy to find in urban areas, but not so easy to find outside of those urban areas.
It's interesting you should say that, because Gaston, who was the wealthiest Black person in Birmingham, also owned the local radio station as well as the local motel.
Yes, he did, and insurance company. And he was actually, Gaston was quite right-wing. He was quite conservative, quite not terribly interested in the civil rights movement. It was only when he saw little children being rolled down the street with fire hoses that he decided that he really needed to get involved in civil rights. He really didn't want to step into that. You know, I think academics have been very critical of the Black middle class, and I think, and I'm not critical, because I think every time Black families went out on the road, they were putting themselves and their families in danger, and they were striking a blow for freedom of mobility. And so I'm not critical of the Black middle class. I think what they were doing was very courageous.
Thank you. About a question that's come in. Professor Sorin, thank you for your informative remarks. One of the things I found interesting is the ambivalent impacts of progress. You noted that highways were important to Black people, and obviously free access was important to public accommodation. But the consequence of an expanded highway system was the destruction of some of the Black communities, and a side effect of the Civil Rights Act was putting Black-owned hotels out of business. Could you say more about those impacts?
Oh, you know, it's interesting. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, and several years ago, I took my daughter. We were in Newark for an event at the Newark Museum, and I said to her, "Let me show you where I grew up." And I tried to show her how to get to the house that I grew up in, and I couldn't find it because all of the landmarks were gone. In Newark, they've put a highway right down the middle of the Black neighborhood, and I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find my way around at all, which was very disappointing. I think that Black communities were the path of least resistance, and it was very easy for municipalities to put highways right through the Black communities. And this was called urban renewal in many cases, or Negro removal. And you see lots of communities where these huge projects were built and people were moved out of their individual houses and they were put into projects. In Albany, New York, looking for the Green Book sites, there were a couple of streets that I just couldn't find. And it turns out that they were part of Rockefeller's Empire State Plaza. He put his major contemporary art collection into a plaza in Albany, and it just wiped out part of the Black neighborhood. So, and I think it's easy to do because the Black neighborhoods were that path of least resistance. So yes, progress, but at what cost?
And another question is from Professor Sheffield. Were there vehicle makes and models that African Americans associated with racial intolerance? Did we avoid certain manufacturers as we did local dealers?
Oh, that's interesting. African Americans really liked General Motors products. The General Motors was the second company to employ African Americans to work in automobile manufacture. Ford was the first. So while American Jews do not buy Fords because Ford was a raging anti-Semite, African Americans do buy Fords because Ford hired African Americans to work in the plant, in the Ford plant. Even though they had the nastiest jobs, the hottest jobs, they made good money. And Ford, in many ways, helps to facilitate movement into the middle class. So Fords were okay with African Americans. Then General Motors becomes the second company to hire African Americans to work in their plants. So Buick is a General Motors product. I don't think there was a car manufacturer that African Americans particularly avoided.
Thank you. And just as one editorial, I loved seeing the picture of the Electra 225. I had a great uncle who was a diehard Electra 225 owner, and it was in our family, it was the deuce and a quarter car that was called.
Yes.
It was a,
the Buick was the most popular car owned by African Americans, the most popular.
Yeah. So I'm going to combine two questions from Professor Bennett and Professor Hemken. Can you talk about the dangers of driving while Black in a rural area like this one? And then kind of added on to that, you talked about travel to visit more urban family in more urban areas, but was it common to go to more rural areas to camp? And was this covered in the Green Book, or was it too dangerous, considered too dangerous?
To camp?
Yeah.
You know, in order to get to a lot of urban areas, you have to go through rural areas. And I think that was one of the reasons African Americans preferred to stay on the highway, because you didn't know what would happen in those rural areas. Most of the Green Book sites, and by the way, the Green Book was only one of many, many guidebooks. There were dozens of these guidebooks that told people where they could stay. And most of them are urban areas. There's something like 144 Green Book sites listed in Harlem, for example. And there are lots in Chicago, lots in Philadelphia, but very few in the rural areas. So you really needed to know where you were going, make a plan ahead of time, make reservations, and stick with those places. Camping was something, that African Americans wasn't a preferred method of travel or of vacationing for African Americans. And even now, the National Park Service has been wondering why African Americans don't spend a lot of time in the national parks. And one of the things that came up when we were talking with people who traveled was that African Americans didn't like the wilderness, because there might be a crazy man with a gun in the wilderness. You might encounter those stereotypes of white people that carry guns and will kill you in the wilderness. And so the wilderness has never been terribly popular with a large number of large quantity of the African American community. So camping was something that was not terribly popular, I would argue.
Thank you. To a question in, what inspired you to write Driving While Black, and what sources of inspiration did you rely on while writing your book?
I was working on an exhibition on the history of Saratoga Springs, New York, African Americans in Saratoga Springs, New York. And a colleague gave me a cover from the Green Book and said, "Have you ever heard of this book?" And I had not heard of it. And I got a copy of it from a graduate student. who was from Chicago, and he got it from the Chicago Public Library. And it's like a phone book. I mean, it really is, there's not much to it. It's just a listing of names and addresses, phone numbers, and a few display ads, and about one article in each issue. And I really wanted to, I was curious about whether or not I could make anything of it, whether or not I could actually turn it into a narrative. And that's really what got me going. What kept me going was, and I mentioned this before we started, was that I didn't think it was about my story. I didn't think it was my experience. But the more I researched it, the more it became a story about my own family. And as I interviewed some of my colleagues, I interviewed Spencer Crew, who's a historian who was the director at the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian. And when I was talking to Spencer, he said, well, you know, I sat in the back seat and my parents never told us that the reason we were traveling the way we did was because of segregation. And I said, yes, that's exactly my experience. They never told us. And so it really became a story about self-discovery. It was an opportunity to kind of learn about my parents and that generation that was really protecting their children from this humiliation of segregation. You know, these northern parents who were kind of not telling their children about everything that was really happening to protect them. Very interesting. So it was personal, became very personal. And that's what really kept me going. And I'm an oral historian. I like to do oral histories. And it was absolutely fascinating to talk to people and hear their stories. And the stories were so compelling. And the stories are such important American stories that don't get told. You know, these were American stories that people just didn't know about. And that really, for me, was important.
Thanks. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions again. Both of these are about systematic attempts to undermine or prevent Black travel or mobility. One is, did Blacks have difficulty getting driver's licenses during kind of the mid 20th century period? And the other is, are you aware of any attempts to sabotage publications like the Green Book or institutions that might be mentioned in the Green Book during this time?
Driver's licenses, African Americans did not have trouble getting driver's licenses because driving was a service that was accepted for Black people. So Black men to be chauffeurs and truck drivers, that was an absolutely accepted profession for Black men. So there was no trouble getting driver's licenses, and they were expected. Very often, a Black man might have a chauffeur's cap next to him on the seat, even if he was driving his own car. But he could put the cap on and pretend that he was somebody's chauffeur and driving driving somebody else's car if he was stopped by the police, because it was perfectly acceptable for a Black man, for a chauffeur to be driving a fancy car. Whereas it might not be, the police might not like it if a Black man was driving a fancy car and it was his car. Was there any opposition? I would say that most of the travel guides had trouble getting advertising. The reason that the Green Book lasts is because they didn't have trouble getting advertising. And the reason was that Victor Green hooked up with Standard Oil, and which was then Esso gasoline. And he was able to get them to support the Negro Motorists Green Book. I think, and I can't prove it, excuse me, but the Standard Oil was owned by the Rockefeller family, and the Rockefellers were Baptists. They were devout Baptists, and they were supporters of civil rights. They, to this day, the Rockefeller Foundations are still supporters of civil rights. There is not a document, not a letter, not any paperwork in any Rockefeller library that talks about the Negro Motorists Green Book that I could find, nor is there in any of the Exxon papers. Exxon is what ESSO used to be. So I can't prove that the reason Standard Oil adopted the Negro Motorists Green Book is because of the Rockefellers' involvement in Standard Oil, but I think that's the reason. I think they were very supportive of civil rights, and that's why the Green Book lasts when so many of the other guidebooks, some of them only have one issue. And the Green Book lasts from 36 to 66.
Thank you. And I'm afraid it is time to pivot to the breakout rooms. And I know that this means leaving a number of questions in the chat still unanswered. I'd encourage folks not to log off completely, to please go to the breakout room. If you had a question that wasn't read or answered here, if you could take it with you to the breakout discussions, which are intended to be a more intimate opportunity to have these conversations. To get to the breakout rooms, I think in the chat, enter either national or campus local, and then someone is going to assign you to the right space. And so if you can enter that in the chat, this will take a couple of minutes to get everyone organized and in the right spot. So be patient as we make this happen. And again, thank you, Dr. Sorin, for the conversation so far, and looking forward to the smaller conversations in the breakout rooms.